started. So last week when we were talking about Chaucer and Burke, which by the way, man, reading Chaucer makes you more human. I just want to say that right now. Um, there's a whole lot of reasons for that, but then we got into Burke, and we left Burke and kind of went on to Chaucer, and then pointed back to Burke with Chaucer.
Right.
And you were like, "Man, we gotta go back and talk about Burke again," because we didn't even get into all of Burke. And I was
Right.
like, "Okay." But one of the things, but speaking about the equality, equity, and equality, and that whole kind of um, the guilt of having wealth or the guilt of being further along in society, like middle class families have, there is there's a guilt to that, and after reading Burke, I think I understand it a lot more. We have a very messed up understanding of what we talk about when we mean equal, like when
Yeah.
people have equal rights. We've taken the idea and concept of equal rights, and even conservatives, and we're like, oh man, if I have, then the other person doesn't have, therefore we're not equal. We'll even think like that with conservatives. We see this amount of wealth accumulated, and we're like, man, this person has accumulated so much wealth, and these people don't have wealth, and the only way that he must have gotten all that wealth is he had to do something wrong to get it. But
Right.
nobody should have that much wealth, and no one should have that little of a wealth, and we think like that, and it's like, there are blessings given to people who do certain things, who think certain ways, and they become a huge blessing to other people. And just because these two people have different amount of things doesn't mean that their equality at the end of the day isn't the same under the law. So most of the time when we're talking about equal, we're really talking about equal under the law, not equal in all things, because all men aren't equal in all things. And one of the ways that Burke starts talking about that is, if I get too far ahead, just pull me back. But one of the ways that Burke talks about this, or is it Kirk? I can't remember who it, because Russell Kirk is kind of doing this thing where he's explaining Burke, and then he talks and inserts his own little thing into Burke. But the way that I think he uses Burke to explain this is that if a person invests, $5, he has every right to the $5 of his investment. If another person invests, $300, he has every right to his $300 investment. That's all his. But the person who invested $5 and the person who invested $300 have a different amount of value inside of the actual market. It's not the same, but it would be unfair and unequal to give and he's making this assumption, the person with $5, the kitty of $300 of value, right? No, he gets the $5 of value, right? That's what he gets. The $300 guy gets the $300 of whatever that is in value of the market. We don't just we just don't evenly give up the market and say that's what being fair is. No. It's as to what they have invested in the market, and what is actually theirs. That value is what they have in the market. And to think any different about it isn't helping us create and promote what equality is, right? That was really helpful, because I think right now we think, when we talk about equality and we talk about rights and we talk about particularly rights right now, we don't know rights as it pertains to what, right? Or what rights actually are, right? And so it was interesting reading Burke and saying, oh my goodness, we are so far from thinking like this. Even as conservatives, we still have that drift to say or think that maybe that person deserves a little more, should have a little more, or something's wrong with the system if they don't have the same amount at the same time, and we're even playing the scales in that way too.
Yeah, and a big part of that, I think, is because like Burke makes it really clear that so he basically was the inventor of what we call civil rights, right? He was the inventor of and for him it was the civil rights fight in his day was for the Irish Catholics. So he's a Protestant, but the Catholics were not given voting rights. They couldn't become lawyers. They couldn't become doctors. They couldn't go to college.
The Catholics,
the Catholics, yeah, in Ireland, the Irish Catholics, and so, and some of it is because of some conflicts that there's a history behind it. It's not like one day they woke up and said, hey, no more of that, right? There were some attempts to um, there were attempts to overthrow the government. There were there were conspiracies by different Roman Catholics and things. But Burke said you can't actually divide the citizenry up that way. Right? The citizens of the British Empire have the same rights, the rights of the British Empire, or the rights of a British citizen. You don't get to say that citizen and that citizen get different rights.
Right.
And so the way we think of and talk about civil rights is because of Burke, right? So and this is one of the things that I think is always really interesting is when you read the history of civil rights, it's always the conservatives fighting for civil rights against the progressives. The progressives then turn around and claim the victory as theirs after they get defeated, right? And so you see this over and over and over. So Burke, he's inventing this understanding of civil rights based on his Christian understanding of what's called natural law. It's the older, and I know we've talked about this some, but that older understanding of natural law that God created the world with certain fundamental principles, certain fundamental moral principles, moral laws that are true, separate and apart from us. We don't create them. So, and that part of that, and that central to that is that's where our rights derive from, is because of who God says we are as people made in His image.
Yeah.
And then also that's derived from our citizenship, which is a historical reality, right? There's a big fight that begins in Burke's day that has to do with slavery and the slave trade, and so Burke is arguing that slavery is not legal on anything that is British soil, and so he wants the colonies to disallow slavery completely, and he just says the color of the skin has no effect on the rights, right? If they're standing on British soil, they're not slaves, right? That's how it works, right? And there was a big case in England in Burke's day where there was a slave that escaped the slave ship, made it to shore, and when they tried to bring him back, the police said, no, you're not allowed to bring him back. He's free now because he's standing on free soil. There's no slavery. Slavery is not an acknowledged institution in the British Empire, on British soil. And so, and this causes all sorts of problems in the relationship between America, because Burke was in favor of the American colonists' legal arguments for the American Revolution, but he also says that there's no way to reconcile your arguments. We can't actually answer your arguments because you've legalized in the colonies that have legalized slavery, because we can't act, because if you to solve the argument, we'd have to give you representation, but you have left the common law tradition by allowing slavery, by legalizing slavery. You've left the common law tradition, and so there's no way for us to bring you back in and give you representation again.
Okay,
in the common law tradition.
So he says basically you're an alien nation at this point. You're not acting like a brother or sister nation legally. There's no way for us to reconcile that. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're a colony, but there's no way for us to recognize your legal standing in the British common law tradition once you've legalized slavery. So it doesn't make any sense. You would have to he says the best thing to do is just to let them go, right? At this point, once they've legalized slavery, let America go. Yeah. Now he also argued in favor of their rights as English citizens for representation if they're going to be taxed, right? You can't tax a citizen of the an Englishman. You can't tax an Englishman without his consent, right? Without his without representation on how the money's going to be spent. So he said, that is a true legal argument that they're making, right? And so on that side, he supported the American Revolution, but he said, but so long as there are colonies that have slavery, there's no way to reinsert them into a representative government because some of their citizens are being kept out of the representation that they're asking for.
Well, that's a oxymoron. They're not citizens, and that's so. But here's the deal, though.
But that's so his definition
of
citizenship, though. Yeah, it is the traditional legal definition, which is you have your feet on the soil and a stake in the land, right? So he said that the Africans that are brought to America, once they have their feet on their soil and have a stake in the land, then they should be citizens. Right? Okay. He's saying you're asking for the rights of a citizenship while not giving it. And so he said the best thing to do is to let them go.
So there's two things there. One is I don't want to forget these two because that begs the question about, according to Burke, what will we look at the southern border as, right? Because now we have a group running in with their feet on the soil, and they're getting here and they're actually getting jobs and working and so on and so forth. So do we now consider those people citizens because of their illegitimate way of getting here, but they have illegitimate way of getting here and crossing the border, but they have their feet on the soil and they have a stake in the land now because of the way that they're working. So that's one thing. The other thing is, do you think Burke is picking up on the idea of personhood that our Supreme Court justices have refused to pick up on? So Burke, when he's talking about the slave who comes into British soil and touches down the land, he's identifying a form of personhood that transcends that's inside of the common law tradition, right? Like This is a person, feet on the soil, investment in the land. We treat them like citizens, right? And it's not, so the question isn't whether or not they're a person or not. We know they're a person. That's acknowledged. And because they are a person, our common law tradition says we treat them as such. Our Supreme Court justice has refused to answer that question, really, in Dred Scott, in Roe v. Wade, right? Obergefell, you can even say.
Right. Well, and I think that is like that's one of the most fundamental questions is what is a person and what gives them legal standing, right? Does their personhood give them legal standing? Is the legal standing something that's granted by the government, right? Or is it a jurisdiction question, or is it a metaphysical question that we're asking? And that is a hard question, because you can have somebody who is everybody acknowledges is a person, but then say, but does this court have jurisdiction over this particular person, right? So, jurisdiction is not something that we even really understand. Have we talked about the definition of the word opinion? I can't remember now.
It didn't hurt to talk about it again, because if you can't remember, it means that we haven't talked about it enough.
Right. So opinion has to do with the original definition has to do with the authority over a jurisdiction making a decision within their jurisdiction, right? So that's why we still call it the opinion of the court, right? The opinion of this court. And that has to do with jurisdiction. So everything within the jurisdiction of that court has to abide by the opinions of the court, right? So I have jurisdiction over my tastes, right? I like this, I like vanilla ice cream. I like, Doritos. Or I have opinion. So those are my opinions because I have jurisdiction over those things. But if I start to say, well, it's my opinion that people should be able to be thrown off of cliffs if I don't like their hair color, then that no longer makes any sense because I don't have that kind of jurisdiction. Right? So talking about opinions has to do with jurisdiction of a particular authority over a particular sphere. Now, when we start talking about personhood, the difficulty has to do with citizenship and jurisdiction. So the state of Montana doesn't have jurisdiction over California, right? Or doesn't have jurisdiction over Texas. So the courts of the state of Montana, when they make a decision, it has to do with Montana. The Supreme Court is supposed to just have jurisdiction over relationships between states, as well as whether or not states are their jurisdiction is limited to the constitutional reach. Did a court overstep its jurisdiction? Right, is what the Supreme Court's supposed to be deciding. So it can say, yes, this particular decision by the state of Montana, or a court in the state of Montana, overstepped its jurisdiction. It doesn't have but the Constitution is what is supposed to define the federal jurisdiction. Right, these are the things that so when it comes to personhood, the question of jurisdiction as well as metaphysics are both are both in play, right? So, and this is where Burke calls he says something like a politician is supposed to be a practical philosopher, right? He's supposed to understand philosophically things like natural law, things like citizenship, things like personhood, things like metaphysics, and then apply them within the sphere of political power, political authority. And we don't have politicians like that anymore, right? Our politicians aren't philosophically thinking. So he actually lost his first. Burke was elected, and then when there was a vote coming up, he voted what he thought was best, and the people that had voted him in called him back and said, "We need you to explain to us why you voted against our interests." He said, because it would have been wrong to vote in your interests, because it would have that bill would have taken advantage of other people and taken their rights from them. And so he lost the next election, but he's got this beautiful speech where he says, "It's not my job to you don't send off somebody to represent you expecting them to always keep your interests in mind. You send somebody off expecting them to do what's right." Right. And before God and before God, I can say I voted on what was right, and it would have been wrong to do what you asked, because the masses don't make right and wrong. It's a beautiful speech.
So,
but we don't have politicians like that anymore.
No, because we actually have a democracy, not a representative republic. That's right. What I've been noticing that more and more. The conservative movement is supposed to look at Burke as their forefather, as their father in the conservative movement. I don't know if Burke would recognize them as children.
No, I mean there are people that have tried to revive a Burkean conservatism, but it's so out of fashion, like it's so out of favor, because there are certain things that. So he believes in a ruling class, for example, right? Aristocrats, yeah, and it's not like he believes in them like we ought to have one. He says it is inescapable that we will have aristocrats. And so they'll either come from a lineage in which there is an expectation of good education, of moral upbringing. Yeah. He's got this whole list of things that an aristocrat ought to have, right? The ability to understand business, to think outside their own interests, to think in terms of the interests of
Virtue.
yeah of virtue, and to recognize the blessings and curses of God in history, those
Yeah.
sorts of things that a good aristocrat ought to have. And in his mind, if you're going to have aristocrats one way or the other, you may as well raise them up on purpose, right?
Mm.
So, because the other option is to end up with aristocrats that are there by coercion, right? By coercive means, who then will use coercion as their main method, their main means of getting things done. And they'll think selfishly, they'll think about themselves and think in terms of interests and interest groups and all of that. And Burke hates all that, right? He said you've got to think in terms of uh, being virtuous and then doing what's right, whether the masses want it or not. Right? That's what a good aristocrat does. And he says
Part of the
it's an inescapable concept. You're going to have a ruling class. You
yeah.
may as well have one on purpose.
Well, yeah, part of his definition, this is what was interesting too, is because I haven't heard this before as far as aristocrat, but part of his definition of aristocrat was a person who can control his vote and one other, right? Like if you look at aristocracies as that, and plus the type of man that they're going to be, he's like, if you have a room full of 25 Republicans, you're going to have 3 aristocrats, right? So you're going to have at least 3, because they're going to say, all right, here's where I'm moving, here's why I'm moving there. And people are going to gather around that one of 3 people in a room. And there you have aristocracy, right?
Right.
And which is going to be followed by who's going to be the most noble, who might even look the best, who dressed the best, who has the most money. Yeah. He's like, it's an inescapable concept that I've thought about before. But as I look at American culture, bro, we got aristocrats all over the place.
Right. Yeah.
What was Trump?
Right. We have aristocrats. The problem is we recognize our aristocrats too late. And so we end up with basically Machiavellian aristocrats that think in terms of power, coercion, and the gathering of power, rather than in terms of service. Right. So the central so Burke kind of has phases in his life, but that the middle phase of his life where he spent doing politics, working on the civil rights of the Irish Catholics, the civil rights of the American colonies for a short time, but it wasn't huge, but it was a short time in his life. And then he spent a lot of energy, years, working for the civil rights of the people of India, right? So, which was a colony of the British Empire at the time. So, but for his main opponent for the civil rights of Ireland was called the English-speaking son of Machiavelli, right? He was, and that wasn't considered an insult the way it is now, because Machiavellian philosophy, as it worked its way out, showed us what it really was, right? We live post Stalin, post Mao, post Pol Pot, right? These Machiavellians that, and we now realize, oh, that leads to mass death. But at the time, that they called it realpolitik, right? It was just the way that politics worked. Whoever could gather the most power got to define reality. Oh, right. And that's and Burke identifies it as a metaphysical error, right? He's the one that identifies Machiavelli as a metaphysical, and he combines Rousseau. He shows that Rousseau was actually fundamentally a Machiavellian. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was the philosopher behind the French Revolution. And that's so the last book Burke wrote was Reflections on the Revolution in France, where he basically predicted the 20th century would be the bloodiest century in the history of the world, because of the philosophy, because of the metaphysics of Rousseau and the realpolitik philosophy of Machiavelli coming together into this revolutionary mindset. So
can Can you break that down a little bit? When you said the metaphysics of Rousseau coming into a marriage with Machiavellian politics, kind of just break that down a little bit. When you say, what is it? What is Rousseau's metaphysic? What does he believe about man? And then what is that marries to so well with the revolution?
Yeah. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau's take on man was that that he doesn't have a nature that comes from within, right? That what he has is, so he's this kind of blank slate nature, and then society imposes onto him
Mm.
his nature, right? So his nature is something that comes from outside. So when you're born into a society, then you're born into a competition, and that competition causes mankind to do terrible, evil things. If you take him out of society, take him out and let him just be a savage, an uncivilized human that just deals directly with nature, deals directly with the woods, deals directly with the jungle, then you would actually get something very noble, because because that blank slate nature has a noble bent that is removed by society, that society takes away the nobility. So so then you end up with, so he said, if you just get society out of the way, then people are basically good, but society causes them to be bad, right? We still see this everywhere. The problem is that people have too much money. The problem is that they don't have enough money. The problem is that the systems of society are causing them to do this, that, or that evil, right? So that understanding that there's not a internal nature, right? There's not a human nature that people are acting out of, or a fallen nature that Burke, that's Burke's argument, is this is just a simple, straightforward denial of Christianity, denial,
Mm.
and then a denial of the fallen nature of man, which Chesterton says is the one doctrine of Christianity that's scientifically verifiable, right? That mankind is fallen.
Yeah.
Um, so uh, so you've got that metaphysic of mankind combined with the realpolitik metaphysic of Machiavelli, that says that since there is no nature, right? Since mankind doesn't have a nature, in fact, there's
Mm.
not a nature behind anything. Everything is in constant flux. If you can gather enough power then you can uh, change reality, right? Your define reality. Whoever has the most power gets to define what is real and what is not real, or define what everything actually is. And so Machiavelli's take is that the best place to gather that power is political authority. It's into a political structure, and so that the political structure is about gathering enough power to define reality or redefine reality, to make it into whatever it is that you want. And so Burke spends his life basically arguing that that the idealism of different revolutionaries is going to destroy the world, right? Is going to end in world war, right? So and it's because they think, well, I've got to get enough power and then I can fix mankind. I can fix society if I have enough power. I can fix the individual if I have enough corporate power gathered, right? And so the revolutions are going to do that. And he says all they're going to do is tear down the fences that have been put up by our forefathers to protect us from ourselves. Right? They're going to tear down all of the things in the name of saving mankind, in the name of an ideal, in the name of establishing a perfect scenario. They're going to tear down all of the fences that we built to protect us from ourselves, which is basically exactly what happened.
I was so I think it's page 44 in the Conservative Mind. This is kind of where he summarizes it, basically saying what you just said. He says no one generation could link with another the way that they're going. Like they can't link with another because they're destroying all the fences. So basically what it is, a removal of the covenantal blessing of history that God has given you, right?
Right.
And to be able to see from that and to adjust. And what the revolution does is completely destroy that fence, like you were just saying, and removes it from the next generation so that they don't know where the borders are, where the markers are, how, this is why we've, when we talk with David Fowler, this is why common law is really so important, is because it is a library of history of how we've gotten here and what's worked best for us to flourish as human beings, right? That's part of what's inside the
Right.
common law tradition. So what we're talking about. When you remove that, then Burke says, man would become little better than flies of a summer. Oh man. Oh man. Like, and it's so true. Like, I just looking, man, you look at the fallout that Roe v. Wade has caused in the Black community over the time period of, I'll give you 1619. Okay. But you look at from 1619 all the way up until now, there has not been a more devastating effect to Black culture than Roe v. Wade.
Right.
More devastating effect, to the point now we have a generation that has no connection whatsoever to their past, to who they were, their people, and they've been severed. And so you have this huge community disconnected from fatherhood, which is what fatherhood is supposed to do, is right. That's Deuteronomy. Fathers, you teach your kids about the covenantal blessing that I have with you, that I brought you out of Egypt, that I were your God and you became my people, and I gave you laws and I protected you and I fed you and I clothed you. This is our covenant agreement. Tell your kids that, right? So that your kids have a connection at the end of the day to this covenant that we have. But we've just, like, with this revolution, kind of destroyed this whole relationship that we have historically with our ancestors as well.
Well, I mean, if I told you that in the county of LA, 66% of all arrests were Black people, and they only made up 13% of the population, you would say, "Oh my gosh, they are definitely being targeted." That's not the arrest percentage; that's the abortion percentage.
Right.
Of Black community, right? So 2 out of every 3 abortions is a Black baby. They only make up 13% of the population. The black folks have been purposefully targeted by Planned Parenthood, because it was begun as a white supremacist organization, right? Purposefully targeted for removal. And it's this Machiavellian idea that if you have enough power and you can get the votes, then it's not wrong, right? It's right. It's no longer so the whole idea of a majority taking advantage of a minority is Machiavellian, right? And that's what the conservative movement was started out of. Hey, you can't actually do that, right? The conservative party, in terms of party politics, because political parties actually began in Burke's lifetime, right? There weren't political parties before that.
Interesting.
Right? So political parties grow up in this era, because you have the breakdown of the older divisions of society that have to do with nobility and gentry, land ownership, the seriously organized, the purposefully organized, historically organized society is beginning to break down, right? And some of that just has to do with the fact that now you've got lords that can't make enough money and merchants that now are making more and more money, and the merchants are buying up the lordships, right? And so because the lords have to sell their own lordship because they don't have enough money and they don't have enough income, right? So you've got a major upheaval that's being caused by the Industrial Revolution. The people are leaving the land and moving to the city. You've got all of this major societal upheaval. Well, in the middle of it, they're trying to figure out how do we keep organized, and political parties is one of the way that things begin to be organized. So he becomes one of the founders of the early founders of the Whig Party, and then he ends up being ejected later in life by the Whig Party because they got some power and they got corrupt, and he stood up against it. And they so he gets kicked out for standing by the original principles of the party, the conservative principles of the party, which have to do with what's called moral realism, right? That there is a metaphysical reality to right and wrong. That it's not a power game, that it's not that you can't just shift your understanding of right and wrong according to the times, right? Either people have the rights that are attached to the being made in the image of God, right? We owe he talks about this, that we are born owing people things, right? Owing our neighbors honor, owing our rulers obedience, we're born owing our ancestors honor and glory, right? Yes. Gratitude, right? We're just born with the debt of love on us already, and love. Go ahead.
And owing a future to our progeny. That's something else too. That was like, no, you don't squander then all these blessings and not create a meritocracy for the future, right? Like you are creating merit for the next generation. That was huge for Burke as well.
Right. So it's this understanding of us as historical beings and moral realism that Burke was defending over against this new wave of a metaphysical, of Machiavellian metaphysic that said, whoever has the most power defines reality, defines right and wrong. That right and wrong isn't something that is the same no matter what. It shifts and changes depending on who has the power. And as the Whig Party gained power, they became more Machiavellian, and he stood up against them publicly, he's in speeches, in writings, and they ended up ejecting him from the party. So he proved with his life that he actually believed these principles, right? He fought for he fought for the oppressed over and over and over, but he fought in a particular way, right? He didn't fight in a revolutionary way. He fought in a reform sort of way. So India is a really good example. He said it's not our job to apply English law to the people of India. It's our job to establish Indian law on just principle, right? And to bring the gospel to them, knowing that Indian law, the historic law of the Indian people, is what is actually our job to uphold, even though they had conquered them, right? So they conquered the Indian nation, and he said the rights of a Christian conqueror do not, or the rights of a conqueror have to be subdued or put in line with our Christian duty to the Indian people, right? And so we don't get so he brought 16 charges against the man who ran ran India. 16 charges against him, and he said, but you're not being charged simply because you broke all the laws of England. You broke the laws of India, and that's where you were, right? And and then he broke the law of God, right? So the law of England, he said, is this combination of the Roman law, the Anglo-Saxon law, all brought in submission to the law of the kingdom of God. He said, this man's job was to do the same thing to the laws of India, right? To bring the laws of India into conversation now with the laws of the empire, of the British Empire, and then submit them to the kingdom of God. So this understanding that people are historic creatures and that morality is real, right? And that over time, when a moral people, a Christian and a Christian people, will bring their laws into alignment with moral reality, historically, and not in a revolutionary way, was the way that he was a conservative. That's
That's
why
interesting.
it's called the founding of that. That's why he's called the grandfather of conservatism.
It's interesting because I think when we talked about Alfred the Great, that's what he did, right? Like that's
Exactly.
how he understood. It's funny because when we talk to Christians and conservatives, there is much more of an imperialistic approach to this, almost like a Chinese form of thinking, imperial, versus a conservative Christian form of thinking about this. Because
Right.
I think what we have is our tribalism is as important as this is interesting, is as important revealed will of God, right?
Yeah.
And so that we have to make people more American, and that's like, but that's not the objective, right?
Right. Exactly. And so tribalism and imperialism actually reinforce one another because they have the same metaphysical assumptions about
Which is
power and humanity. Right? So
uh,
the that being a part of my group is what makes you human, is what makes me human, and it what makes you human. You're not a part of my group, so you don't have the same human rights as me. Right? So and in empire, uh, you've got citizens and non-citizens, and once you conquer non-citizens, then they can have the rights of citizens, but you have to conquer them first, and you're allowed to conquer them because they're not human yet. Right? You're allowed to take their stuff. Like if I go out into my backyard and there's an alligator that has claimed a portion of my yard, I can move it, kill it, throw it out, wrestle it, whatever. And because it's not human, that alligator doesn't have human rights. An emperor that thinks I'm going to go get that piece and make it a part of my empire is treating those people as if they are not yet human. Once they're a part of the empire and they become citizens, then they become human. But that our citizenship, the claims of legal jurisdiction are wrapped up in the metaphysics of whether or not somebody is a human or not, both in empire and in tribalism, right? In a tribal mindset. So versus what Burke is arguing for is that the people of India they're human and they have a God-given jurisdiction over their land and over themselves, right? So individuals have a God-given jurisdiction over themselves, families have a God-given jurisdiction, and then nations have a God-given jurisdiction. Cities, counties, there's God-given jurisdictions. And the people of India have that, and that we don't that is not undone by the British Empire conquering them. Right now, I couldn't find a lot of information about whether or not Burke was in favor of imperialism or not, because he sort of steps into the scene when there's already a British Empire. But he definitely argues that the people of India, that the people that we have conquered, they actually have a God-given jurisdiction over their land, and that their laws are legal. Right? Their laws remain legal. That you actually that they are attached to the land themselves, that the jurisdiction of the Indian people is a real jurisdiction, and you don't get to just say, now it's gone. Or that's not the way legal works. Or he wants the people of the nation of India's laws to begin being brought into the conversation with the laws of the British Empire.
and to bring them into, so you have laws that are here. And so what he's assuming though is that there is a general revelation that operates in his metaphysical understanding has to be there's a general revelation that operates in the world that even pagan man can see this and operate in that way. And where we find that general revelation that comports to God's standards and God's law and the tradition of common law, those things need to be unified. And where they don't, those things need to fall away because it's not matured yet. Is that fair enough to say?
Right.
This hasn't.
Yeah. But there's a legal way to get rid of bad laws.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So I want to go back because I asked two questions. I did the horrible thing as an interviewer. You should never do this. Is ask two questions at the same time. Yeah, I always ask one, but I do it sometimes when I don't have time. But the other question I was asking about for Burke, speaking of citizenship, a people whose feet are on the ground and have investment in the land. And I asked you, how then do you think Burke would look at what we have happening in particularly our southern borders?
Right.
They got people who are crossing over the border illegally, feet are on the ground, and over time they have investment in the land. What do you do now?
Yeah. Well, there's two issues though, because there's the what do you do now, and then what do you do with the border itself, right?
Yeah,
so,
sure.
Right. So the what do you do now? Traditionally, the answer has been that people that are born here should be granted citizenship.
Yeah.
Right. And that people that want citizenship should be able to become citizens in a straightforward way. We have destroyed both of those things, right? So we have Gnosticized citizenship away from the soil and made it about some other thing, right? So so you can have somebody that's a third generation, fourth generation person born in America that isn't a citizen. That doesn't make any sense. Right. But what we've done is we've made the path to citizenship complicated and dangerous. Right. So what makes it dangerous is that it shifts and changes. Right. So you don't actually have the consistency where you know what you're going to get. Right. So if you know,
so law isn't law.
Exactly. The law is not treated. You don't have equal protection under the law. So if you know, hey, the way to citizenship is to go to that office right there and begin the application process. And if I do that, then and I complete the application process and I take my covenant vows as a citizen, then I can become a citizen. Then people will do that. If you don't know whether or not this day, if you show up there, you're going to get arrested or not. Right. You might not. The next thing you know is you have created a black market of non-citizen space. Right. So
you've incentivized a certain form of how to gain citizenship one way or another.
Yeah. And so, or why to avoid citizenship.
Right? Sorry. Yeah. How to get inside the country without having to actually go through the process of citizenship.
Right. So so we lived down in California, right in the salad bowl of the world, right? So you've got all of the farms along there. And, we had, a man in our church who they had a big berry farm, and he was one of the scientists that developed new raspberries and new strawberries. You know, he was a really brilliant guy. But he said that their farm was a Christian-owned farm, and so they hired pickers, right? So people that come up and they move around. They hired pickers and every year, and they provided housing. They provided. But they also kept a doctor and a dentist on staff for the farm. And so while you were there, you got all your medical and dental and everything. And so, because it's easier than dealing with insurance, you just have a doctor and a dentist that you have on staff, and take care of people to, you know, and you pay. And he said, but one of the other things we do is we make sure we give them all of their paychecks. And I was like, well, what do you mean? He said, well, one of the unfortunate practices that a lot of the farmers do is when it comes time, they finish their last round picking and they don't tell them which is going to be their last. And then they, instead of the last paycheck to everybody, they call the immigrant police, and a raid happens and everybody runs for it, and they never have to give their last paycheck to anybody. It's like, that's, people do that.
Wow.
He's like, yeah, and I mean, he's just like, it's evil, right? It's evil. That's the way a non-Christian runs a farm down there, though, is that's the expectation, is that you've got this weird relationship with it's the ICE. Is that what it's called?
Yeah,
the ICE.
yeah.
And he said it's really, really wicked. He said, but he said some of those people have their workers permits, right? They have they're there legally. He said, but it's not worth it to risk, so they run anyway, right? Because you know that justice is not guaranteed, right? And so you make a run for it, right? And so he said, so why would they become citizens? It's not like justice is rolling down like
Wow.
waters, right? So it's a really it's a lot more complicated than we think, because it's not as if people come across it illegally, and then it's just,
Oh yeah.
there's a clear distinction, right? You've got folks that have been here for 3 generations. They own a house.
That's what I mean.
Right?
Yeah. So like, that's
they
what I
own
mean.
a house. They paid cash with it because they worked hard. They saved. And then they one day they get arrested by the ICE and sent back. Sent back, but they're just dropped off in a foreign land. They don't even speak Spanish
Anymore,
right?
because after 3 generations, yeah, that's so. Then are those people? So you would say, according to Burke's tradition, those people, they're citizens.
They're citizens. Yep. Their feet are here, and they have stake in it, right? So now and the way to citizenship wasn't as complicated back then, though. I mean, you didn't have so bureaucracy wasn't invented yet. I think that's probably a good way to put it, right? Bureaucracy is something that gets invented on purpose. That's what's crazy. There's an Italian fascist who invents bureaucracy thinking he's saving the world. Where you have, instead of offices that are personal with authority, you have you have hired people, hirelings, that whose job it is to get people's paperwork in order and get the right, get people to move through and get the right stamps in the right spot, right? And then then you have to give them the thing that they have accomplished. And I think I have a theory that the metaphysic of Machiavelli actually requires bureaucracy.
Bureaucracy, yeah.
Because it's a bureaucratic metaphysic, right? It's an understanding that the nature of the world is fundamentally bureaucratic, right? Whereas in Christianity, it's not, right? We have a personal God, right? God doesn't say, here are the boxes you need to check. Once you get all these things taken care of, once you put these things in order, then come back to me, and then I'll accept you, right?
Well, yeah, it was that kind of bureaucracy that wouldn't allow Black people to vote in America.
Right, exactly.
It's being legal. So it was legal, but bureaucracy, right?
Right, but there's a bureaucracy that gets in the way, and that bureaucracy is a manipulable power structure, right? And that you can make it into whatever you want, right? It's a belief that there's not a real that there's not a real structure to the world, that it's something that we have to create and add to it, right? So if you remember, Kant said that our ideas impress they impress onto the world an organization, right? So the organization of the world comes out of our ideas, right? Or out of our concepts, right? And bureaucracy is saying that the organization of society, the organization of the power structures of society, are something that we create and then impress onto the world. Whereas an older understanding, or a Christian understanding, is that that there is personal authority and responsibility that is given to certain people within their particular sphere, within their particular jurisdiction, and they are personally responsible for it. Right? And they don't get to define what their jurisdiction is. They don't define what they can and can't use their power for in terms of their authority. Right? That's all defined for them, and then they wear that office. They wear that particular jurisdiction or authority, but they don't define it. That is derived from an understanding that fundamental reality is defined by God. Right, that God is the one who is that way, and the good news of the gospel is that Jesus died on the cross personally for his people, right, to save the world. Jesus is the one who did it, so we come to him and don't expect, or we come to him, and there are no bureaucratic hoops to jump through. He is personally saying to us, well done, my good and faithful servant. He is personally saying to us, I know your name. I know that I have a name for you that no one else knows or has. I speak to you personally. I promise you personally. I baptize you personally. Right? I feed you at the table personally. That there aren't bureaucratic hoops to jump through. That Jesus is the high priest. That is the one who stands between us and the Father, right? So that understanding of the personal rule of the world, that it's not a clock that is wound up and let go, that it's not it's not a mass of chaos that our concepts organize, right? But it's personally ruled and defined by the Father, Son, and the Spirit. Personally. So
okay, so Jason, what does that have to do with immigration?
Well, so what it has to do with immigration is that that a person that comes across the border, you don't get to define them, right? That God is the one who defines them, and so their citizenship is a historical reality that we acknowledge. It's not something that we get to say, that we get to define.
Okay, so their citizenship is a historical reality. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
That we don't get to define.
Right.
Yeah, the only thing that we get to define is whether or not that citizenship is in America or in Chile or Mexico or Trinidad. So
right.
So there's a real border that I, as a governor, have an office over and exercising has been right.
Right. And that it's a responsibility to protect.
Right. And so it's the government and the civil magistrate, your local civil magistrate, as well as the federal government in this particular situation, are both responsible for borders. Mm-hmm. Right. And so someone because
you were asking about what do we do with the people that are already here?
Oh, well, I'm thinking of both. I'm thinking of people who have
so the question of what do you do with your borders, though, that is also a reality that's defined by God historically and not by us.
Okay, granted. There's no argument there, but my question is, so I think we worked with the third generation person who's here. We see that they've invested inside of American society. Their feet are on the soil and they have stake in the land. You got somebody who has just gotten over here within the last year or two. We've had a run. We've seen 10,000 people marching across the American border, or trying to anyway. We've seen an influx in the last 50, 60 years. I think in the last 2 years, we seen in last year, 2020, 2022, 2021, was it 1.4 million people influx right into America? Almost 2 million people or something like that, just coming right through.
Right.
What do you do with that? Are those people American citizens because they got a job now, or what?
So this is the problem. You have this, and this is why it's so important that the authority is actually personal. And because this is why it causes problems to vote in somebody who has bad metaphysics. So,
Mm.
because you have somebody saying at the very top, come on in. We're happy to have you, and there will be no issue. You're welcome. And then purposefully pulling people off of the border so that there's no longer any protections
Right,
at the
right,
border,
right.
right? So you don't have a well-defined border, right? And you have people saying, "Hey, you can come in," but there are remember there's layered jurisdictions legally in America, but then also in God's economy. So you've got this is where you have difficulties. So whose job is it to protect the border? Federal government, right? That's part of their constitutional job. The states that are border states, right? That's part of their job. And then the counties that are
Yeah.
border counties, right? So you've
And
got
I
the
would even add
sheriff.
one. I would even add individuals who have property lines. I would go to them and say, individuals that are there, they have property lines. That this is my property at this point, right?
Yeah,
I get
I
to
th- I
protect
th-
that sphere.
I think that they have that there is no longer individually owned property on federal borders. I think that is something that so so the federal border is now there's a width on either
Mm.
on the
Between
federal
which
border
where property
between
lines
there's no
start on.
personal property. Yeah. So
Well, okay, wait,
but
hold on.
if you have personal property and people are coming through, then you have that responsibility.
Well, wherever the line where the federal property
Yeah.
ends and my property begins, there's still a border there,
Yeah, yeah. Right. So
right?
there's personal there's personal jurisdiction or familial jurisdiction because it's not there's a personal head of the family, but it's a family
Yeah, yeah. I
it's a
grant
family
that.
jurisdiction. Yeah.
I grant that.
So um uh so but here's the difficulty is the federal government they take over and then they say, "Hey, we're pulling back. Everybody's welcome. We're not going to finish building this wall." Now, whether the wall was a good idea in the first place or not, they send a real message by it being partly constructed and stopped, right?
Yeah, right.
Um, then you have the states saying, "Well, okay, we'll protect it, except for the federal government's not giving the money like they used to, and they're not giving the support they used to, so that's a problem." Um,
Right.
and then the sheriffs that have tried to stand up and say, "Okay, well then we'll take care of it," have been lampooned,
Yeah.
attacked, gone after.
Right.
So what do you do at that point? Um, you have, you have personal familial people doing the best they can. You have the Arizona militia has formed that's trying to protect the border. There's a great
Right.
show about it coming out on Lore TV soon. You should go check out American Recon. It's amazing. Um,
Yeah.
but so you have people trying to figure out how do we protect this border, because it's not like you say, well, okay, we're going to open up the border and all of the uh, all all of the people that are just looking for better opportunities for their family are going to say, okay, well, we'll come across, right? You get some of those people. You also get people, that bringing that's where all of the fentanyl in the country comes across the Mexican border. You've got all of the drugs and the human trafficking, right? All of that stuff continues to happen along the borders, and now we've got unprotected borders. Now, ideally, right, what you have is gates, right? So that the people that are coming, Jesus says that the people that use the door are the ones that are friends of the family, right? Right. So
That's good.
that's how you can tell who's friends of the family. So you have gates that are welcoming, that say, "Hey, we want tourists to come across. We want people that are interested in working, people that are interested in being citizens. Here's the way to do it. We want you to come." That's not a bad. It's not a bad thing. Immigration, historically, is a huge blessing
That's right.
when immigration has channels through which it's easy to become a citizen. It's been a huge blessing to our country, because population is a blessing, right? God just says straightforward, a king with no population is cursed. Right?
Right.
A king. Yeah. So you want, but the problem is we don't treat citizenship as if it's a real thing. We don't treat people as if their humanity is a real thing. And so when they're not in our jurisdiction, then they're easy to take advantage of. They don't have equal protection under the law. And we live in a time and in a place where the people in power don't want to give equal protection under the law. And so they do what they can to keep people in a place where they're easy to take advantage of. And that's what a lot of our immigration policies do.
Right.
They keep people in a place where they're easy to take advantage of.
In more than one way. They use them as voting blocks. They use them, get them hooked to their own political drugs and so on and so forth. But still, overall, would Burke consider those people citizens? They're here 6 months. Yeah, what does it mean to have your feet on the soil and your investment in, the land? So at what point then do we say, okay, those people who came here last year, that illegals, we have a messed up border. Do we have a position now as conservatives, the way that Burke will look at it, is say, you know what? We have to say those people are citizens.
I think what you do is what you have to do is say, here is the easy way for you to become a citizen, right? Because now we do have a significant amount of bureaucracy. You've got a lot of, so you could locally, I think, say, hey, they pay taxes, they all this, so they're citizens. But there's a state citizenship that amounts to a federal citizenship, although I hope we never get federal papers, even though that's being pushed for all over it.
Isn't that what your social security number is?
It just, yeah.
You got a social security number, bro.
I got to take you up to, there's a great, it's a bar and a tobacco shop up in Coeur d'Alene.
Oh, Marcus is telling me about this.
Yeah. Place. So their Wi-Fi password is taxation is theft. and I'm not a libertarian, but Marcus is. So as soon as he's more libertarian than me, maybe. But anyway, I was like, hey, do you have Wi-Fi? He's like, yeah, here's the password. I texted Marcus. Hey, Marcus, you got to come check this place out. But it's a cool shop. But I think there's a federal overreach that is a reality when it comes to our citizenship right now, that we have, that I don't know what it's going to look like to roll it back. It will be rolled back as history moves forward somehow, whether it's through a collapsing. My suspicion is that it's going to, there's going to be an overweening, right? It gets too large and can't survive under its own weight, similar to the way the USSR did. They will have something along those lines. But one way or the other, citizenship now is a multi-layered thing, and figuring out how to make that path clear, and then giving people, and then becoming a just place where there's not where it's not going to be used against you. This is, I was in Iraq and was preaching at some of the churches in the over there, and one of the things that was really interesting is I was there at the 2-year anniversary of the legalization of Christianity. Right? So, and there are celebrations. But when I was talking to one of the pastors of one of the churches that became a public institution, they bought a piece of property. They said, it's really hard. We had a split within a couple of months of the legalization of Christianity, because about half of the pastors and the congregations in the city didn't believe that the legalization was real. They thought it was a trick. They thought it was a way to get them to come out of the shadows so they could be identified, and then they would flip it on them and go back to being illegal. But now they knew where you were, they knew who you were. And so half of the pastors and churches stayed invisible.
Wow.
Because they didn't trust the government.
And why would you?
Right, exactly. Why would you? And I think we have done something similar to immigrants. We haven't given them good reason to trust that the citizenship offer isn't a ploy. Now, because it is a ploy, right? So that's the, things like the Dream Act. That was a ploy. That was a way of padding the votes, and they weren't. There wasn't everybody knew it, right? Everybody knows this is a way of padding the votes. And so and honestly, I think the Republicans were only upset because they didn't think of it first.
So I'm not satisfied with this conversation right now.
It's super hard. I mean, I don't think this is an easy one to solve.
I don't know. A part of me feels like, WWBD, what would Burke do? And that's kind of the question I'm having right now, because I'm looking at, the more and more I'm reading Burke, the more I'm realizing that for Burke, I think he would have a whole bunch of positions on the practical side of it, the legal side of it. He would have a whole bunch of answers for that, but he would argue that none of these are going to hold up apart from a virtuous people.
Yeah. Oh yeah. 100%.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so I don't think that right now, as we're answering, you can listen to some of the biggest and brightest of conservative talk radio and people who have conservative worldview opinions, and they're like, oh, that's really creative. And nothing that I hear on there do I ever find them preaching for a form of virtue. Yeah. What was the line that Burke said? He said, freedom lasts as long as a wolf, lasts as long as a sheep amongst wolves, right? Without virtue. Right. So you don't get this freedom that we're all talking about and that we all want just by implementing certain laws and things in place. You have to have virtue if any of this is going to mean any sort of thing. And virtue is the kind of thing that shows itself in public, which is the way Burke lived, but is developed and lived ultimately in private. It's something that happens in a person's heart and mind, and those kind of convictions bubble out from their local places into the rest of society. Yeah. Right. And so as you talk about immigration and you see how much it lacks virtue and how it thinks about a human being, here's the trick of our federal government is, hey, we're not going to really arrest you. Yeah. Don't come over here. We're not really going to arrest you. There's not going to be anything. Come on over. Right. That's kind of the two different. And so they come and then, hey, we'll take care of you. We'll give you all this stuff. But it's contingent. Right. It's contingent on something. It's not really your freedom. Right. Yeah. There's no virtuous people at the end of the day operating here. Right. This is the same thing I was thinking about with, if you want to know, if you're a person in the middle and you're thinking about, man, I don't really have an argument or a dog in the fight for pro-life or pro-choice, let everybody do what they want to do. This is really simple. You need to ask yourself if you're a virtuous person. And then if you are, where are the virtuous people lining up on this? Because it's not hard to look at a woman who wants to kill her own child and say, well, that's not virtuous. Right. Because wherever the virtue is, wherever you find the most amount of virtue is where you're going to find the most amount of freedom. Those two go hand in hand. And so it's not hard to find, everybody's trying to figure out what's the most freest place to live and why is that? Well, all you got to find is where's the virtue at?
Right.
Where do I see virtue living strong? And that's where you're going to see the most amount of freedom, because virtue says God is the one who has given us laws. We're to flow in line with that and to be consistent with that, and then to live with each other in a reasonable, understanding way, seeking to love and do great for each neighbor. That's virtuous, right? And fearing God in that process. So it's not hard for us to find virtue, but you look at like you just described for the last 15, 20 minutes with the whole immigration thing and all the problems in it, there isn't any virtue inside of that type of system at all.
Right.
So part of the sad thing that happens with people who are running to America, they might have more freedom than where they were, but at some point that type of system, that type of setup is not going to grant them a long-term form of freedom at the end of the day. Right, because virtue is lacking in that process. That's not going to end well for you. Because so like the churches, the churches are looking at in Iraq, are looking at the virtue of the government and said there has been no virtue here.
Right.
Right, none. Why would we then trust them to treat us well when virtue is lacking? Why would we trust that we have freedom if there is no virtue in this government? Because if there's no virtue, there's nothing to hold these people to their convictions at the end of the day. And
Right.
so it makes the people who come over here illegally because the system is broken and doesn't work stay underground as much as they possibly can, and maybe to 2 or 3 generations, because they know that at any point, depending on how the vote swings versus the virtue that's inside of these people, we don't have a chance of staying here.
Right.
And so then the part that it seems like that Burke would want to spend his time really getting at the bottom of this would be almost like Adams. We want a moral and upright people first.
Yeah.
Right. We don't have, even while we're having this whole destruction of our society, our moral foundation, our biblical commitment to God and his world has to come we have to come some sort of repentance about this that starts building virtue up again, because
Right.
our virtue is bankrupt.
Well, and what's really interesting with Burke, so he went after the public wickednesses of the British Empire.
Yeah.
And it was for him, it was the way that the Irish were treated, the Irish Catholics were being treated, or that they weren't given, that they were disenfranchised. So that franchisement, we don't use that word anymore, but has to do with having the rights of a citizen, right? So they were disenfranchised. They were not given the rights of a citizenship, which had to do with voting, but also had to do with they were kept out of the educational process. They were kept out of the legal profession, the medical profession, all sorts of things. So he went after that vehemently. And what's so interesting is, even though he was a Protestant, he was working on defending their rights. There were all sorts of people that said, "What are you doing? They're not your people." And he's like, "That's not how this works." Right. So he resisted the tribalization. Right.
Uh-huh.
And then he went after slave trade. Right. It was a blight. And then he went after
same issue, right? It's
same issue, the treatment of the people in India by the British Empire. Right? So he went after the public sins, and really hardcore. Right, lost his position at times. He almost died penniless because of it, because the way that a lot of politicians would survive was they would basically take bribes, to survive. So their paycheck wasn't enough. They would take bribes, and he just refused his whole life, and all of that. And so he almost lost everything because he spent his life going after the public or the corporate sins, the public sins of the empire, of the British, of the crown. Now and then, but he said it's actually not enough just to go after what's wrong with the other side. You actually have to build up the a positive philosophy. It's not enough to say this is what's wrong with them. You have to build up a positive philosophy. And I sent you that one quote by the Frenchman that spent a bunch of time with Burke. It said, "What's Burke's philosophy?" And he said, "Conservatism is enjoyment." That was Burke's philosophy, right? That he took joy in his life. So his argument was that that reality was beautiful, right? And so the best argument is to put on display the beauty of reality, right? And that would resonate with the reality of people, so that that true morality, true virtue was a beautiful thing, right? And so when you explained it and described it and made it beautiful, that it would resonate with people and that they would want to be more virtuous. Now, he was a Orthodox Christian, so he understood that these were all means that the Spirit uses. But he won over, in his day, he won over most of the major and most popular poets to his position. And so they started. So a major reason that conservatism won the next generation was because all of the artists were won over by Burke. They were won over by the beauty of his arguments. He wrote an entire book on aesthetics, on aesthetical theory, and the resonance of beauty with reality. Right? So he won over the poets, the storytellers, the dramatists of his day. One of his early opponents was Samuel Johnson, who was the greatest literary mind of the day. By the end of his life, Samuel Johnson was arguing Burke's positions, right? Samuel Taylor Coleridge, William Wordsworth began as progressives, revolutionaries when they were young. By the end of their life, Burke had won them over to the conservative cause. And so they're writing against the French Revolution by the end of their lives, and writing in favor of the beauty of true morality, the beauty of the way morality resonates. And it's a way of embracing the goodness of creation, right? Morality is a way of embracing the goodness of existence, the goodness of being. And that's something that I don't think conservatives believe anymore, which is what I think conservatives tend to be just as Machiavellian as progressives. I think in terms of, if we have the power, then we get to define what's right and wrong. So we'll make compromises to gain power because power is the thing. But the reality is, a moral life is simply more beautiful. A moral society produces better art, produces better music, produces better poetry, better stories, better movies, right? That is a central part of what our argument needs to be. We produce art, poetry, we produce movies, we produce television shows, we produce music that's just better because it actually resonates with the moral realism of reality, that reality has a moral shape. And when so if you go to old churches that are built, old, beautiful, well architected churches that are built before the microphone, right, they have a particular shape so that when the pastor stands at the pulpit, that his voice is projected. And there's even acoustical pews, right, that push the sound up to ear level, right, so that the sound will resonate through the pew and hit and go up to our ear level, right? Well, reality has a particular shape, and when you live a moral life, it resonates and it's amplified by reality because you're speaking with the grain of reality. You're speaking into reality in a way that resonates. And so that beauty has to be, I think, central to our argument if we're ever going to make
That's
any headway back.
so then does that need to be more of our criticism, is that this isn't beautiful? Because when I think about here's a couple examples. I think about the patriarchy movement right now, and when I think about conservatives, one of the things that they exist, they have grown in popularity for, is being more anti something than pro something else, right? So they've been anti egalitarianism inside of the patriarchy movement. They've been anti feminism, right? But I haven't seen them be very strong pro women, so much so that you can say something like there isn't a more valuable human being on planet Earth than a wife and a mother, right?
Right.
And and all of a sudden they'd be like, hey, what about fatherhood? So important. It's like,
Yeah.
right. No, I'm saying, like, for sure, no doubt. But you don't have a wife, you don't have a mother, you don't exist. Right.
Yeah.
Like you do understand that, right? Like you do have to it's so much so that they promote the beauty of women. There's a sense of protecting women without promoting the beauty of women, so that people don't see that. And the same thing inside of the conservative movement, that I've seen them be more anti-trans, and I don't mind being opposed to wicked things. I'm totally opposed to wicked things, but I'm opposed to wicked things because they mar the beauty of nature, right? Like that's what I'm upset about, is that you are when a man dresses up in to take the place of a woman, or someone decides to wear blackface, what they're doing is insulting the beauty of the nature that God has given to these people, right? And those two things run the same for me. Blackface and drag queen and trans are doing the same thing. They're all marring the beauty and the image of a image bearer, and with something that God is trying to communicate to us. That's part of the insult. But I find that there's more of and I'm not trying to use the left as a marker for how they see us. But if you ask most people, what do conservatives represent, you don't get pro stuff, you get more anti stuff, right?
Anti stuff. Yeah.
And that's if you ask conservatives. Well, what does conservatism mean? Right. Well, it means that basically we want to conserve old traditions and oppose anything that's new. And that's not conservatism at all. Burke didn't even like that form of conservatism.
Right.
Right. And so there isn't a vision for beauty ultimately at the end of the day inside of conservatism. And that has been bothering me for the longest, is where's the beauty at?
Yeah. And the thing is so I've seen a lot of people, so when it comes to art, I've seen a lot of people mock and oppose modern art and the modern art movement, or the postmodern art movement, and because it's silly, right? I mean, it is when, the splatter paint and all that, it really is silly. There's not so, but if we were producing art that was beautiful, you wouldn't have
It would
to.
it wouldn't survive the day.
Yeah.
It wouldn't even be seen.
Yeah. So but we don't even teach the history of art. We don't even, it's not like there's a bunch of people going around saying, this is all right, but it's no Botticelli, right? Because people don't even know Botticelli. They don't know art. They don't know the history of art. They don't know the greats. They're not familiar. They haven't been moved by beautiful art. And so when they stand in front of something that's not beautiful and they're told it's art, they don't have anything to compare it to. Right? So it's not like they're saying, well, I was really moved by this beautiful art over here, or that beautiful art over there. And this doesn't do that to me, right?
Jason, this is funny. This goes back to our conversation last time we were talking about literature and why literature was so important. It's part of the tongue that we get defined by, so that we all embrace this tongue, this English tongue. And so that is part of our culture, part of our who we are as a people. And as we were thinking, and this goes to what you were just saying, part of what has been the biggest attack on minority cultures, particularly Black culture, because is the defining of Black culture away from that. So they define that ain't Black, right? And so then that not being Black, all of a sudden separates them from anything that is part of the English tongue or language. Which, by the way, if you've read, was it White Liberals and Black Rednecks, you know that the idea of whatever being Black is don't exist anyway, right? Like that's. But what's been the most.
That's why I've written in Thomas Sowell for president for the last
every
5
time.
elections.
but the thing that hurts is the segregation from a group of people from their roots, so that they can't embrace and know the beauty of their culture. That is your culture. That is your tongue. That is your people, right? That's your group right there. There isn't that. You don't have to try and create some subgroup that disconnects you and dislodges you from the historical covenantal reality. That's where you die at, right? That's where cultures go to die, is when you do that. But instead, embracing that and seeing the beauty of it, you're able to say, wow, we got a rich history, and you can attach yourself to it versus detaching yourself from it and be like, where do I start from? Right? Yeah. Like you become, instead of becoming a fly in a summer that fade away, you actually have a lineage now that you are entrusted with. You're entrusted with Mozart, right? You're entrusted with all these
that's the thing is, every time someone is baptized, they're baptized into the inheritance of all things. Right, all those things become theirs. Right? That's the
prove it. You can't just say stuff like that. No, you can't just say stuff. Prove it.
I am embarrassed that I don't have the Bible verse off the top of my head.
I think I can make the having read Richard Wallace's book on Calvin and the Table. I think I can make the theological argument. I'm trying to think of an exact verse. I could think of a few, but I want you to prove it, because you made the statement, buddy.
Revelation 21. So Revelation 21. Then he who sat on this verse 5, then he sat on the throne, behold, I make all things new. He said to me, write, for these words are true and faithful. And he said to me, it is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give the fountain of the waters of life free to him who thirsts. He who overcomes shall inherit all things, and I will be his God, and he shall be my son. Right. So we inherit all things.
Oh, it keeps going. To the thirsty, I will give from the spring of the water of life without payment. The one who conquers will have this heritage, and I will be his God, and he will be my people. But as for the cowardly, the faithless, the detestable, and for murderers, the sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. So you get all things, or you get the lake of fire.
Or you get the lake of fire. Yep. And so,
which is another baptism.
Oh yeah, it's the anti-baptism.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
But so, and so the process of history is the process of taking down the inheritance out of the attic, right? That's what all of history is we're taking the inheritance down from the attic, we're dusting it off, we're laying it out, we're trying to figure out how to use it, knowing all of this is our inheritance, right? So
wait, say that again. The process of history is taking the inheritance out of the attic.
Yeah, just going up, finding it, saying, oh, here it is. dusting it off, saying, "How do we use this? Because we've got an eternity with this, with all things, and that's what we're going to be."
Bro, okay, I'm trying to find it. This is this is it does two things. This is from Burke on page 45. He says change is inevitable. He says that and is designed providentially for us. The larger conversation of society, properly guided, change is a process of renewal. But let change come as a consequence of a need generally felt, not inspired by fine spun abstractions. And this is going to your point right here. This is what I want to get to. Our part is to patch and polish the old order of things, trying to discern the difference between a profound, slow, and natural alteration and some infutation of the hour, right? So that's exactly. So he's saying we have a responsibility to take those things in the attic, bring them out of the attic. As you said that, it hit me. It's like, oh, this is conservatism, and to polish those things off, and to say, okay, this thing, whatever this beautiful thing that we have as inheritance, how does it move on through time, becoming more beautiful? So we polish it off, we pass it to the next generation, and pass it to the next generation, versus saying, what's this? And then move it along with the time as, in some other way.
Yeah. Bonhoeffer in Life Together says the most destructive thing in the church is idealism. Right. Is to instead of saying, what do we have here? How can we move this particular community one step more towards godliness, to say, what is the ideal and how do I impose that? Or how do I come to this congregation and say, you guys are we gotta fix you, right? We gotta fix you from the ideal down, instead of from the embracing the congregation as it is, and saying, what is one more step towards maturity take? Right now, one more step towards maturity every year gets us a long way towards maturity, versus the guilt and the shame of idealism as our motivators. Those things don't last. It
makes you take things out of the attic and throw them in the trash, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Just connect you from those beautiful things in the attic that you've been handed, right? The polishing off is to say, oh, well, that didn't work so well, but they had a lot of things that did, and there's a structure to this that they've gotten, they've built on. It was like, okay, let's build on that too. You polish it off and say, here goes, this is where we've talked about this before. This is where they shipwrecked at. Let's not shipwreck there.
Let's not shipwreck there.
And let's keep. This also is a place where I think that people who are evangelicals find Catholicism attractive, because it does have a sense in which they are willing to polish off the old, but they're never willing to move to the new, right? There isn't a progression ultimate. That's where their fall is. But at least it looks like it's not doing this individualistic kind of setup that we have right now running rampant inside of evangelicalism.
That's what it looks like from the outside. But the difficulty is then you get in there, and I've got a number of friends that have jumped ship and ended up Roman Catholic, and what they tend to say is, after a little while, they say, it turns out that none of them really believe the stuff. But that's the difficulty, is they say, oh, here's the catechism of the Catholic Church, this is what we believe, and then there's no discipline, they don't even believe their own catechism.
From the outside, you're right. So I'm sorry, I interrupted you a moment ago. What were you saying?
Well, I was just going to say that guilt and shame as motivators they don't work long term, right? You might get a little bit of momentum with some guilt or some shame, but every time you have to up the ante, because you actually end up hardened by guilt and shame. You end up with you grow, your conscience hardens under guilt, and it hardens under shame, whereas forgiveness keeps your conscience soft, right? So if you feel guilt and you realize that it's an objective thing, oh, I really am guilty before God, and you go to the Lord and say, Father in heaven, please forgive me. Because Jesus died on the cross, he says, I forgive you. He takes the sin away, and your conscience remains soft. Or and it's the same with shame. When you realize that something you do is shameful, and you go to the Lord and ask for covering, right? Because Jesus died on the cross naked and took our shame, we receive the covering of the blood of Christ, and our shame is taken away, and our conscience remains soft. If guilt and shame become motivators, which is what happens in idealism, right? You see this right now with the in the church. You see this a lot in the legalism, but you see it in the progressive movement with things like environmentalism, the guilt and the shame that gets pushed on us. The problem is you have to keep upping the ante, upping the guilt, turning the volume up on the guilt, turning the volume up on the shame to get the same reaction. I realized recently that it's a little like heroin, right? That a little bit of heroin at first gets you really high, but then you have to keep using more and more and more. And guilt and shame work the same sort of way. You keep having to use more and more and more. This is the classic. You've got the aunt in the family, or the mother-in-law, or the brother who is always trying to make you feel guilty to get you to do what he wants. And pretty soon they're like, look, maybe I'll just kill myself, right? Because they have to just keep upping the guilt. They have to keep upping the shame to get the same amount of motivation out of a person, right? Well, God doesn't function on that economy, right? And the God
Nor
doesn't.
does the world work like that either.
The world doesn't work that way, right? God doesn't mature us on a guilt and shame economy. He forgives our sins, and so we fear him more, right? He takes away our guilt, he takes away our shame, and he changes our fundamental desires. Augustine says when God wants to change us, he reveals to us the beauty of his son, right? And that is what actually is a continual motivation, because love, when you act out of love, it actually is it's a renewable motivation, right? The more you love, the more renewed your love is as a motivation.
That's something too, that you are, because of the kind of being that you are made to be, you're the kind of being that expands. So you're going to expand either in love or in guilt, right? And either love is going to continue to feel that expansion, or guilt is going to continue to feel that expansion. And one of those is going to you're going to explode at some point. Like you say, just kill myself. Or you're going to serve with joy that keeps expanding and keeps growing at the other side of it. It's so, anyway, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I was just thinking about that. That's one of the things too, that's like, when you're looking, speaking of virtue and how Burke looked at things, if you're looking at the world in a virtuous way, then you're going to fill the world with virtue, right? If you're thinking about it that way. But if you're thinking about it another way, or that doesn't lead to human flourishing, that's what you start filling the world with. This doesn't work right. It's like putting diesel in an unleaded tank. It's not going to work the way you need it to work. It's going to hiccup. It's going to have problems. And Burke is like, you can't work the world the way it's designed. This is where and a couple of times you see this, he talked about the broken metaphysics of Rousseau. It's like the world doesn't work that way, which is really like so encouraging, because I'm starting to see more and more, because the world doesn't work that way, then I know, regardless of what it looks like, this isn't going to be sustainable.
Right.
I know long term, this cannot be sustainable. So even though everybody is laughing at me for building the way that I'm building, I know something about the world that they are suppressing. Right.
Yeah. This is Abraham on his way up the mountain with Isaac.
Right.
It says why was he willing to sacrifice his son? He said, because I believe in a God that raises the dead. Right.
Yeah.
I understand that the economy of this place is personal, and it's resurrection. It's a resurrection economy that is personally overseen by God the Father, God the Son, God the Spirit, right? It's not a machine. It's not a it's not it's not a clock. It's not
No, it's
it, it,
covenantal.
yeah, it's covenantal. It's personally overseen. It's not a bureaucracy. And so I know that being faithful to God who raises the dead is the way to move with the grain, to move with reality. Um, and it's such a different way of approaching things. And that's why David can pray, Lord, I'm surrounded on all sides. You promised to take care of me. You promised to provide for me, and I'm looking around and I don't see it. So where are you? Right?
Hmm.
That he
On
can
your left.
say, yeah, exactly. Right? He can pray those prayers, those personal prayers, because he has promises from a personal God. He's not living in a bureaucracy where he has to say, okay, I'll take things into my own hands, which is what Abraham does when Isaac isn't born and Isaac isn't born and Isaac isn't born. He says, I'll just take things into my own hands. Where's your servant, Sarah? Bring her to me, or, oh, you're bringing me your
Right.
servant, Sarah. Okay. I'll take things into my own hands, where
That
he'd
was,
forgot for a moment that's not a bureaucracy.
bro. That was that was another one of those moments for me, like the rainbow robe, where it's the garden repeated all over again. Here's the promises of God. This is what's going to happen. It will come. The woman then comes to bring the fruit. Taste, eat here, and it's like, and what does Sarah do? She does it, like, hey, why don't you, we can make this happen. It's like, but that's not how the blessing's supposed to come. Right. And
Right,
what does
right.
Abraham do? All right. Right. Like that's no. And that's the repetition again of that story, that narrative. Like, that's not how it's supposed to go. And Abraham's supposed to say, no,
Yeah.
that's wrong. He should have stopped it right there. And he didn't stop it.
He's supposed to lead his family, right?
Yes.
And, yeah. And say,
So
no, this is not how we don't live. This is not the kind of place that everything is answered with scientific knowledge.
right. Right. Yeah. You might not be able to figure out, but God has, and that's who we're
Yeah.
going to trust. So what are some things that if you were going to inject a antibody into conservatism from Burke, what would be some of the things that you would put into that injection that from Burke?
I mean, I think the antibody is a couple of things. Um, I think right at the center of it is that the truth is beautiful,
Mm,
right? And so we don't actually have to answer every objection, answer every opposition, right? That presenting the truth is actually an argument, and that because the truth is beautiful, it's going to resonate. And if the truth doesn't resonate with the people, then it's because of a moral failing of the people. But it's still the truth that sets us free, right? So that we actually, and I think this is something that often in apologetics we get wrong in the Christian realm as well, is we think we need to be able to answer every possible thing, right? We need to study all of the cults and all of the false religions and study every heresy, um, and we do that without ever getting around to coming to a deep and abiding uh, understanding of the truth, right? But that actually is the most important thing: is a deep abiding understanding of the gospel is the best defense against heresy, right?
mm,
And politically speaking, a deep and abiding understanding of the beauty of the truth, right? When the beauty of the truth moves you, you are safer than knowing every in and out of the progressive movement. So, so I think that's one thing, and then I think the other thing is just the historical nature of the work of God, um, is something that we that conservatives tend to think that our job is to work from a different set of ideals than the other side, that we've just got better ideals, rather than saying, well, actually, we're a part of a long story, and our job is to complete our act well, right? So we're
With what has been
act,
given us, right?
yeah, exactly. So we're like the 80th generation since Abraham or something. Like I know it's less than 90. It's been less than
Are
90
you
generations.
serious?
Yeah, yeah. So it's our job to do this 80th act well, right? If that was Act 1, right? If the preface was the first 11, that's the cold open. The first 11 chapters of the story is the cold open. Credits come. Abraham enters the scene. That's the beginning of Act 1. We're in Act 30, something like that. And it's our job to just faithfully be in our act. And that means knowing what came before and knowing what we're trying to pass on.
No, that's not what dispensationalism told me. This the last act, Jason. We the last ones.
Yeah.
No.
That's one of the funny things, man. I just read Pope, the story of Gilbert. I can't remember which pope he was, what his throne name, his pope name was, but he's the pope that in the late 900s over into the 1000s, and this was before the belief in like the papacy being infallible and all that. So he's just the Bishop of Rome, so there's a big Roman university, a big Vatican University in Rome. It wasn't called Vatican University yet, but I think that's what it's called now. And he was a mathematician. He was born very, very poor, entered the second estate when he was young, became a monk and then a priest and then a bishop and then ended up the Bishop of Rome, Pope. But he was a great mathematician. He was the one that introduced the Arabic numerals, right? We use Arabic numerals instead of Roman numerals for our math, and he was the one that introduced that. He started a program, an exchange program with Islamic universities down in Africa, because some of the greatest scholars in the world when it came to math and science and Aristotle and different things were in Africa, and so they would exchange universities. He worked really hard to establish missionary churches in Islamic areas to be able to convert the Islamic people. So but one of the things that he lived through was the belief that the year 1000 would be the end of the world. So it's the same arguments the dispensationalists use about being the last generation and doing the math and all of that. Everybody thought that, or it took over the imagination of the church for 40 years or so, that the end of the world was coming, and he had to just keep saying over and over, except it's not, right? We've got to make it through. And it's the book was called The Abacus and the Cross. It's a really great book, a lot of fun. And you learn that so it's before the Crusades. So there was this period before the Islamic people started attacking, that there was some much more of a philosophical debate between where Islam was treated more like a Christian heresy than a separate religion altogether. So but everybody's always thought they lived in the last generation. I mean, not everybody, but that has happened before. And what it does is it causes the church to quit expanding, quit sending missionaries.
It does. Well, and it makes you do a philosophical inquiry into the origin of ideas. Is that Edmund Burke's book on aesthetics that you were talking about? The Sublime and the Beautiful?
Yeah. The Sublime and the Beautiful.
Yeah. All right, just making sure I bought it so I didn't have to.
It's not very long, but it's really interesting.
You know what? The other thing that a takeaway from Burke that I thought was super helpful for me was to reestablishing the idea and concept of rights. So I think you're hitting for sure the foundational pieces, and then some of the areas that are detailed that is kind of like for rights. Right now, the biggest scream and cry is you are removing my rights from me,
Yeah.
right? In the Roe v. Wade situation, and people are saying, I have the speed internet. I have the right to, I think they just spent 64 million, was it? $64 billion in 64 billion to make sure that tribes areas as well as minority communities and pretty much everywhere rural areas have high-speed internet and don't have to pay necessarily for it. There's like some sort of $30 credit or $50 credit, depending on where you stay, you can have a credit. And it's a right now to have high-speed internet because of what happened with COVID, by the way. So high-speed internet, it's a right. The right to medication and Medicare, right? And just everything is now considered a right. And so we have lost what a right is. We've lost the concept and reality of what a basic right is. And part of what we're arguing for is a right under the law, right? That's what we were talking about earlier. It's like, what is your right under the law? What are protected under the law that you have a right to, that everybody is treated the same under? And the idea and concept of that right is absolutely lost. So it doesn't exist anymore. So that a right now is mixed up with a desire. My desire to have high-speed internet is a right. And what Burke talks about and does, and he reestablished for me, is that a right, it seems the way that he's defining it then becomes a point. If it's a right, then it's something that someone else has to provide for you, right? And that's what the left truly gets. It is a right, and because it's a right, you then have to provide it for me. So that's why you see cake bakers getting hit. It's my right to get married, and so then therefore you have to provide it for me. They're not wrong in thinking how a right works. What they're wrong in thinking is they have a right to do something in which they don't have a right to do. And so if it's a right, then you have your responsibility in order to be able to do that thing. If it's a right that you have high-speed internet, then I must be the one who to provide it for you in some way. Someone has to provide that right for you in some way. If it's a right that I have citizenry because of my humanity and being a citizen, then I need to be able to have the structure set up to vote. Right. That needs to be provided for me. And what Burke does is reestablish the idea and concept of what rights. I was trying to find the exact page because it was so good. I was like, oh, that's one of the areas we've completely like bankrupted ourselves on understanding is what a right is. Oh yeah, here it goes. We gotta go. But I just wanted to read this real quick. So he says the true natural rights of man then are equal justice, security of labor and property. So equal justice, right? Security of labor and property. So I would say that would he be arguing that the government or the civil magistrate has a right to protect your labor and your property, right? So if you work for something and you've accumulated it, it should be protected so no one else can take that away from you. I'm sure what he would say without due process.
And the right to work, right?
And the right to work is security of labor and property. Yeah. And then the amenities of civil and institutions and benefit of orderly society. I was like, the amenities of civil institutions. What is that?
So the civil institutions, that would be like anything that all the institutions of the government. So the judicial system, this would be where the ability to vote, providing a place to vote, that would be a right. What other civil institutions would have existed?
Well, I'm sorry, I might have. It's the amenities of civilized institutions. So that would be the same thing, though. So these institutions have an order. They have a way to engage that is civilized and common and protected. So you can't go like and threaten other folks and voting and stuff like that. I'm sure that those things are protected, civilized institution. I can go there without threat or harm or coercion of one way or the other. and the benefit of orderly society, that would be like, police, you know, um, uh, the legal system actually being done in a way that due process, all those type of
Yeah.
things. But that's a small list, right? You're right.
Right.
That's a small. It's not a huge, vast list of like, okay, internet, cable, got to make sure you have housing. That's a right. You got to have housing. Right? That's not a right. And we've forgotten. Even listen to conservatives talk. They've moved off into, well, it's not left right. This is rights, but in a conservative way. And we've allowed all these other things. So when we look at bills, and we should be passing into this stuff because it's not a right for them to have anyway. And so
Yeah.
it's just one of the things. And go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, it's the difference between rights to something, right? You have the if somebody, like, you see, you hear, we can even talk about one that's maybe more controversial, right? Do we have a right to an education? If we have a right to an education, then it's somebody's responsibility to provide that service, right? So that otherwise my human rights are being violated.
Right. Exactly.
So that's a right to something, not a right from something. So if I have a right to a peaceful society, then that's basically somebody is violating my rights if they sneak into my home and try and rob me. Right? They're violating my rights. If nobody's coming into my house and I'm just sitting there, if I'm a teacher and I'm not teaching, then I'm violating somebody else's rights.
Right.
Right. So it's a right from something versus a right to something.
That's the thing about, we talked about before. It's so important. Positive law versus negative law, right?
Yeah.
Almost everything we're doing now is positive. The 10 Commandments are not. They're negative, right? It's limiting. And so there are things that are virtuous inside of the positive side of the individuals should be doing. Those are virtues, right? That we want to do. Right. So you seek the good name of your neighbor, right? But because you haven't, the part in which that was restricted, you can't harm him, right? Like you can't harm him. Now you should be seeking the good nature of your neighbor, his good name, and so on and so forth. But if you don't choose to do that, that's not like there's a civil code in which we say, hey, you didn't seek 3 times today your neighbor's good name, therefore you need to be punished.
Right.
So, yeah. But anyway, I got to run. But is there anything else you think we need to walk away with from Burke? Because I just thought that the idea and concept of rights, particularly right now, Burke really does a great job of defining those things. He saw a long time ago just how obscene it would become if we started saying everything was a right. And this was from the revolutions. The revolutions were arguing this kind of thing, which made me say even more so, Jason, oh my goodness, we're in the middle of a revolution.
Yeah. We're in the middle of a revolution right now.
Right. We are. It seems the thing that our government is bending towards and giving to people. It's your right for internet. Whoa, that's a revolutionary idea according to American society. You don't have a right to internet like that,
Yeah, I mean, but this particular revolution has been creeping in since the 1920s. That's the problem. Is now we're just expanding. We're expanding the things that are a right? So public education as a right is something that I think was the nose of the camel, because everybody looked at it and said, well, I don't want to keep kids from being able to read. Right. So that rather
what
than
a monster.
saying, what kind of monster wants to keep people from being able to read? The irony is that the literacy rate has gone down, right? But that was the original argument, is back in the dark ages, nobody could read. But in America, before public education, you had a higher literacy rate than you have now. So if the public education's job was to educate, then it's been a miserable failure. Now, it's possible that there was something else that they were designed for, but we know that what they haven't done is educate well, because we have an uneducated populace now. We had an educated populace before. So,
And I just want to say, and I want to add to that too, though, is people have to understand more and more education and what it's for. Part of why you, even with people who are extreme and seem well educated because they have degrees and went to college, they still can't follow a logical argument. That's a failed education.
yeah,
You might as well be illiterate in so many other ways if you can't follow a way of thinking and logical arguments, because you're going to be almost as bad to society from the things that you create than as well as a person who would be illiterate in the things they create. At least a person who could be illiterate can work certain jobs that create human flourishing. A person who has a bad education in public society can diminish in more than one way a whole society in a way that an illiterate person could never do.
right. We have,
you know,
I mean, I once, that was standing out in front of church and talking to a guy that was walking his dog. And I was explaining to him the story of Jesus and Jesus being raised from the dead. And he was like, raised from the dead? What do you mean? Like he was dead and came back? I was like, yeah, Jesus was raised from the dead. He was like, that's crazy, man. I said, have you never heard that before? He's like, what do you mean heard that? Is this common knowledge? Guy had a degree, right? The guy had a bachelor's degree. He was a graduate of college, and he had never heard Jesus rose from the dead. He went to an American university. He was raised in America and never heard that Jesus rose from the dead. So you think, well, what did you read? How could you have gotten all the way through 16 grades and never come across the fact that Jesus was raised from the dead?
Any form of literature at all.
At all. Yeah. This is the point that Jordan Peterson makes.
I was thinking about that. Yeah.
Is that the literature underneath all of the literature of Western civilization is the Bible, right? So it is. So you can't actually understand the Western literature without the Bible, and he just says that that's the reality. As far as I understand, he's not himself a Christian. He doesn't believe in that, but he's coming, man. Can see. I think it's probably true, but you got other guys that say that too, like Neil Gaiman. He's just a great storyteller. He's a kind of weaver of yarns in English literature. I've heard him say a couple of times something along the lines of, somebody that says, I want to be a storyteller for a living, but hasn't read the Bible and studied it. He said, I just don't believe them, because it's the most popular book of stories ever in the history of the world. Every time it goes into a new culture, it immediately becomes the most popular book of stories in that culture. So if you want to be a storyteller, but you've never studied the Bible, he said, I just don't believe you that you want to be a storyteller. And he's not a Christian. He's a novelist. He's a good novel. He's a great novelist. But he can see that it's the most popular book of stories ever. So if you want to write popular stories, you should try and figure out how it is that these stories continue to resonate with people. And I think that's what Burke is arguing, is the truth is that sort of thing. It will resonate with people because it's beautiful, right? And that we don't have to manipulate. It's not a power game, right? That it's a truth and beauty game that we're engaged in. It's a storytelling contest that's been going on since the devil entered into the garden and said, hath God said, right? That we're in a storytelling contest, and that the truth and the beauty of goodness does prevail if we believe it and put it out there. And so then that's something that I think conservatives definitely need to learn.
I've walked away with this, especially from Burke. I think he says where's this? I think did I text you this line, or did I text Jared? Jared's here, by the way, waiting for me to leave here. It's patiently waiting. I might have sent it to I didn't think I sent it to Jared.
We got to have Jared on for one of these conversations.
Jared definitely has to come on for these conversations. I must have sent it to you, Jason. Did I send you a text last night? Yes. As
Yes,
Alfred with Coben justly remarks of Burke, his ideal is neither Protestant or Aristotelianism, nor Catholic theocracy, is much more like the kingdom of God on earth.
Right.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Ooh. Let that settle in. Let that settle in.
This is why I always tell people, no, I'm not a libertarian. I'm a conservative, but there aren't any anymore.
Right.
The conservatism has been walked away from by the conservative parties over and over and over. But when it rears its head powerfully.
Well, and hopefully it's rearing its head right here on Knox Unplugged, because this is the thing. Conservatism, I don't care who you are, Presbyterian, Charismatic, 1689 Baptist, and I don't care who you are. Conservatism at the root of it is the kingdom of God here on earth working its way through the lump. That's what it is.
Yeah.
That's what it is. So then what do your laws reflect? What does beauty look like as a society flourishes? We can almost everything now that I look at on the news, I look at in papers that I'm reading, every article that I come by, my question has been, where is the beauty in this? Or is it ugly? And if it's ugly, then I need to talk about it like it's ugly.
Right.
And if it's beautiful, I need to talk about the beauty of it. Right.
When people ask me what is conservatism, because when you say something like that, people say, well, wait, okay, well, what is conservatism? I always say conservatism is that it's the government's job to protect a space for me to play baseball with my kids, and that the baseball with my kids is the important thing. The government doesn't do anything important. The baseball with your kids is the important thing, right? And I've never had anybody say, I don't want that. Right? Everybody is like, oh, yeah, that's different. That's not the Republican Party. I'm like, yeah, it's not.
Because it's beautiful. Yeah.
Right. But it's beautiful, right? That the argument for the truth of conservatism is that it's beautiful.